Hi, I'm Andy Egan, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Rutgers University. I work mostly on philosophy of language.
And I'm Joshua Knobe. I'm at Yale University and I work in experimental philosophy.
And today we are going to talk about moral relativism, which is an area where both philosophy of language kind of stuff and experimental philosophy kind of stuff sort of become relevant and come into the picture. So one thing about relativism, sorry, I was just glancing off at my iPad, which has my notes on it. So one thing about moral relativism is an extremely unpopular view. Philosophers standardly really hate moral relativism. They think it's terrible. They also standardly think that the folk are deeply committed anti-relativists, that part of making sense of ordinary folk moral practice is making sense of the objective pretensions of morality, making sense of morality as something objective and non-relative. And one thing, so maybe we can start by Josh talking about some of the evidence that maybe the folk aren't so deeply committed objectivists as all that.
So you
You
wanted
want to say something about that, Josh?
Yeah, so earlier experimental studies that were designed to test whether ordinary folk believe in relativism or objectivism always seem to indicate that the ordinary folk are opposed to relativism. And the way these studies were run was always more or less the same. So participants would be asked some moral question. So they'd be asked, say, suppose that one person murders another, and they'd say, what do you think about that? Participants would say, I think it's morally wrong. But then they'd say, not every participant in our study answered the same way on this question. So, although you said it was morally wrong, some other people said the opposite. They said, for example, that it's not morally wrong. Now the question is, what do you think about those other people? Do you think that they could also be saying something true? Or do you think that what they're saying has to be false? They must be mistaken. And when you ask people that kind of question, across a whole series of studies, you always get the same basic type of answer. The majority of people say, those other guys must be mistaken. They have to be wrong if they think that this action could be morally permissible. So these data coming out of some early studies really seem to give a lot of weight to this idea that philosophers had, that ordinary folk are consistently opposed to relativism.
Right, but then there's some of the more recent stuff shows that ordinary folk not in fact so opposed to relativism as you might have thought from the original studies, yeah?
Right, so a number of us started thinking that maybe there's something more complex going on here. So I teamed up with a number of other researchers, including Hagop Sarkisian, Jennifer Wright, John Parks, and David Tian. We ran a series of studies trying to look at the situation in a different way. So in our studies, subjects were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. So subjects in the first condition, they received something almost exactly like the stimuli that subjects had received in earlier studies. So they were told, suppose there's this guy, Sam, he's just an ordinary student at your university, but he has some unusual moral views. Now suppose one of your classmates thinks about some given act of murder, that this act is morally bad. But Sam has the opposite view. Sam thinks it's totally fine. Does one of these two people have to be wrong? Or could they just both be right? However, there were also two other conditions. In the second condition, what we called the other culture condition, participants were told, imagine there's this other culture, this culture of Amazonian tribespeople. And in this culture, they have really different values, really different ways of life. They're separated off from the Western world in a really deep way. And then the question is, suppose that one of your classmates thinks that this act of murder is morally bad, but one of these Amazonian tribesmen says, no, there's nothing wrong with it, it's just completely fine. Now, does one of them have to be wrong, or could they both be right? And then in the third condition, they got an even more distant kind of other culture. So they were told, imagine there are these extraterrestrial beings, the Pentars. The Pentars don't care at all about love and friendship and so forth. Their only goal in their existence is to increase the total number of equilateral pentagons in the universe. So they just go through the universe trying to increase the total number of equilateral pentagons. And now,
was there a principled experimental reason why it had to be equilateral pentagons?
Oh, is there a reason why they're equilateral pentagons? Maybe we just created that for some random reason. But then, participants were told, if one of them ever gets too old to really participate in this task, that extraterrestrial is just killed and turned into an equilateral pentagon himself. No one thinks there's anything wrong with this. And then participants were told, suppose there's this act of murder, and one of these pentars thinks that that act is just completely morally fine, while one of your classmates thinks that it's morally bad. Does one of them have to be wrong, or could they both be right? And what we saw in the first condition with Sam, the classmate, was that we just replicated exactly what we find in earlier studies. So people said, if Sam thinks that that is fine, he has just got to be wrong. That cannot be correct. But in the other culture condition, we see a change. People start to be at about the midpoint, sort of evenly divided between saying that he has to be wrong or that he could be right. And in the case of the extraterrestrials, it goes even farther, so that people are actually strongly committed in that case to saying, no, if they think it's morally fine, and someone from here thinks it's morally bad, well, then they can just both be right. So it seems as though there's a kind of relativism in people's ordinary intuitions, but that this relativism is somehow only coming out when we begin turning to people from more distant cultures, people who are sort of different from us in some fundamental respect.
Right, and so this is what's different about the studies that you were running from the original studies, that you're varying the... you're allowing some of the people who are making the judgments that are being evaluated to be from very distant cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then, but you might think that the views we have in which something is relative to something else can really only come out when we introduce a manipulation like that. So, for example, suppose that one of us said that it's right now summer and the other said it's right now winter. If we just ask people, does one of us have to be wrong or could we both be right? Then the answer would be that one of us just has to be wrong. But that's not because people think there's some objective truth about whether it's summer or winter. Clearly it's summer in the northern hemisphere, but winter in the southern hemisphere. But that idea we have that it can only be summer or winter relative to a given hemisphere, that only comes out when we begin considering people who are very different from us in a certain respect. For example, people who are speaking from a different hemisphere.
Right. So this, I mean, there's a whole bunch of other extremely cool studies in this paper. I'm sort of wondering whether to ask about more of them or just to move on from here. But maybe move on from here and then come back to more study stuff later if we want. Or do you want to say some more about some of the other studies?
Let's go.
So one of the things this suggests is that the folk are not as attached to the objectivity of moral claims as sort of philosophers at least might have thought they were.
Mm-hmm.
That they allow for a member of culture A who says it's right to do something, it's right to perform some action phi. A member of culture B says it's not right to perform some action phi, and both people can be getting it right. Actually, I guess one of the other studies that's interesting is the sort of testing for whether those are judgments of faultless mistakes or really getting it right, really tracking, really saying something true. And you did have a study that tested for that, right? So one thing you might think, one defensive move you might make, trying to retain the objective. Retain the view that the folk are committed to objectivity and morality is to think, well, no, what they're doing when they're saying the pentars aren't wrong is really they're saying the pentars are making a blameless mistake or something like that.
Oh, right. So we did try a study in which we varied the question that subjects were asked. So some participants were asked whether the person had no good reason for their view, and other participants were asked whether the person's belief was incorrect. So you might think that, of course, these pentars or these people from the Amazon, it could be that they have perfectly good reasons to think the things they do, so in a certain sense they're not wrong to think them. Yet the beliefs they have in these cases are still, in some deep sense, incorrect. But what we found wasn't that kind of pattern of results at all. If you ask about moral questions versus non-moral questions, then about the non-moral questions, people tend to think that someone from another culture could have very good reason to think different things from the people in our culture, but still the things that they think basically would be incorrect. But about moral questions, you see the opposite pattern of results. Although people are somewhat willing to say that these people from other cultures have no good reason for thinking the things they do, they're very reluctant to say that the beliefs they have are actually incorrect. So it seems like what people are really saying here isn't just that they might be justified in believing something different from what we believe, or that they're not messing up in some sense, but that they could be believing something that actually is correct relative to their culture.
Right. So that's an extremely interesting kind of result. So, I mean, one thing. So one sort of possible lesson to take, and I mean this is all potentially very contentious. There's lots of places to try and get off the bus, but one potential lesson to take from this is, well, the folk don't really hate relativism as much as philosophers take them to, and they don't hate relativism as much as philosophers tend to. And in fact, maybe at least some members of the folk are sort of signed up. Their practice reveals that they're tacitly signed up for some kind of relativism about morality. And then that raises this question about how you're going to try and make sense of some relativist view. What would it amount to for some relativist view about morality to be right? So this is one of the places where the sort of philosophy of languagey stuff and philosophy of mind stuff starts becoming relevant, is in trying to make sense of what moral relativism could possibly amount to, what it could be, what kinds of things there could be to believe such that their truth or falsity would be relative to different assessors.
Right, and so
there's a bunch.
Yeah, so in
go
recent
ahead.
work, it seems like you've been developing this kind of general framework, even independent of morality in particular, that can help us to make sense of this idea that we can believe things that are true relative to one person, but not true relative to another.
Yeah, that's the hope. Trying to make sense of that anyway. So there's a bunch of different kinds of things people do. So John McFarlane is currently doing stuff on this. I'm currently doing stuff on this. Max Colville is currently doing stuff on this. There's a bunch of people working on this kind of thing right now. More in linguistics, Peter Laserson is doing stuff on this. Tamina Stevenson. I'm not going to try and give the full list. I'm going to leave some people out. But so there is a sort of pre-existing tradition of people who describe themselves as moral relativists. So Jamie Dreyer and Gilbert Harmon in particular run this moral relativist line, and the kind of line that they run is a line which, if you found it in epistemology, would be called a contextualist line. So according to them, moral claims in different people's mouths express different propositions. So close enough to the view that when I say it's right to give to Oxfam, the proposition I'm expressing is that it's right according to moral system M to give to Oxfam. And when you say it's right to give to Oxfam, I'm doing air quotes for the video. When you say it's right to give to Oxfam, you're expressing a proposition of the form. According to moral system M, it's right to give to Oxfam. And the moral systems that get contributed for our two different utterances may or may not be the same. So it may or may not be that we express the same propositions when we make moral claims. And so one way that it could turn out that the Pentars say that this murder is permissible and we say that this murder is impermissible and we both say something true is that we're saying different things. So we're saying it's impermissible according to system M1. The Pentars are saying it's impermissible according to system M2. It really is permissible according to M1. It's really impermissible according to M2. I think I may have just reversed the systems, but
I was thinking an interesting way maybe of trying to figure out whether that is how the folk are thinking about it is just ask the folk whether these two people disagree. So you say if the two of us are facing each other and I say something's on the left, but you say it's on the right, then I think if we ask the folk whether you and I disagree, my at least hypothesis would be that they would say we don't disagree. We have exactly the same view about where it is. It's just that given where it is, I can express that by saying it's on the left, and you can express it by saying it's on the right. But now, suppose we turn to this other kind of case, the case in which the Amazonian tribesmen say this thing is morally fine, but your classmate says no, it says it's really morally bad. Would people say in just the same way, well, they don't really disagree, or would they say that somehow they do disagree? I guess in advance of the data, if I had to just guess, I would say that they would say, we do disagree.
Yeah, that's what I would guess too. Right, and this is one of the worries that certainly Dreyer has a bunch of stuff to say about this, about how to make sense of moral disagreement given this kind of contextualist framework. But on the face of it, it looks like this is a really big problem. It looks like you've got when I say it's right to give to Oxfam, and I'm in a context that contributes moral system M1, and you say it's let me make myself the villain. I say it's bad to give to Oxfam, and I'm in a context that makes moral system M1 be the one that's contributed. You say it's right to give to Oxfam, and in your context, moral system M2 is contributed. We're not disagreeing any more than we would be disagreeing if I said I'm hungry and you said I'm not hungry. And sure looks like we're disagreeing. It sure looks like it's not just the same kind of talking past and failure to express incompatible propositions that you get in standard kinds of cases with context-sensitive vocabulary and index clause.
So this seems like it creates
the contexts of the two speakers are different.
So this seems like it creates a real puzzle, because on one hand it seems like ordinary folks do seem to have this sense that there's some disagreement in these cases, that it's not just like saying something's on the left and someone looking the other way saying it's on the right. But on the other hand, they do seem at the same time to say that although it's a disagreement, it can be the case that neither person is wrong. So it seems like if we wanted to preserve our sort of ordinary notions, we need some framework in which people can disagree without anyone being wrong.
Yeah. So the kind of framework that I'm working with is in part designed to do that kind of thing, and you still get this kind of problem. But let me first sell it and suppress the problem a little bit, and bring the problem out. So here's one thing you might want. You might want that when I believe that it's right to phi, and you believe that it's not right to phi, we believe incompatible propositions. There's the things that we believe can't both be consistently believed simultaneously. That's something you might want from disagreement. Reason to think maybe it's not sufficient for disagreement, but it's at least something you're going to want. And you don't get that on the face of it. You don't get that sort of automatically on the contextualist kind of views. So the kind of framework that I want to use is making use of this notion of de se belief that you see in David Lewis, attitudes de dicto and de se, similar kind of thing you see in Chisholm, see in a few other places too, where the idea is, well, look, there's something sort of doxastically in common between all of the well-informed people who live in Cleveland. There's something all of those people believe, and it's believing that it's this doxastic similarity between all the people in Cleveland that makes it so that they look at maps of Cleveland and not maps of Baltimore when they want to get directions. Makes it so that they go in for all this sort of Cleveland appropriate behavior. Similarly, sort of famous example is the example of believing that your pants are on fire. There's something that's doxastically in common to all the people who sincerely assert my pants are on fire, and that in virtue of which they all jump around and try and put their pants out in that distinctive kind of way. Whatever it is that's doxastically in common to all those people, it's not that there's a common possible worlds proposition they all believe. Because for me to believe that I'm in Cleveland, the relevant possible worlds proposition in the neighborhood is that Egan's in Cleveland. For you to believe that you're in Cleveland, the relevant possible worlds proposition in the neighborhood is that Knobe is in Cleveland. So we needn't believe anything in common about the world in order to both have this interesting doxastic feature that's going to make us go in for Cleveland appropriate behavior. And so one thing to think is, well, there are these objects of belief that are there's this thing to believe that's not a possible worldsy thing. It's not a belief about how the world is. It's a belief about where you are in the world. And so when we both believe that we're in Cleveland, we both believe this de se thing. We both one way that people put this is thinking of belief in terms of the self-attribution of properties. So we both self-attribute being in Cleveland. And so we stand in the belief relation not to some proposition that takes a truth value relative to a world, but to some property. And to believe the property is to self-attribute it. It's to take yourself to have it.
But do you think that...
And that's what's in common to all the people who think they're in Cleveland, is they all self-attribute being in Cleveland. It's what's in common to all the people who think their pants are on fire. They all self-attribute having burning pants.
But do you think if someone believes that, say, abortion is morally wrong, their belief should be understood as being something similar to believing that you're in Cleveland? It's like believing something about yourself, where you know that you might recognize other people are not like that?
I am increasingly inclined to believe that. I don't want to fully sign up for the belief in that, but I think it's actually a view that ought to be on the table. So, I mean, one kind of question to ask there is, okay, so suppose you want to say moral belief is, they say, moral belief is a self-attribution of some kind of property, which can vary across, which such that some people in the world can have it and other people can lack it. Which properties exactly? Let me first just say why that would help with the sort of thing to be explained. So one nice feature of this sort of general recipe for a view is that you get, if you think that believing that it's right to give to Oxfam is self-attributing some property P, then it can turn out that I'm correct to self-attribute the property and you're correct not to self-attribute the property, or vice versa. And so it can be that there really is a common object of belief. There is some, or there's a common object such that I believe it and you believe its negation. Or there's a common object of belief such that I can believe it truly and you can believe it falsely. I can be correct to believe it, you can be mistaken to believe it. And that looks like it helps to sort of clear the way for getting disagreement, or at least to not getting talking past. Is you've got a common subject matter for everybody's moral beliefs. It's just that it's the sort of subject matter such that the truth values of the things to be believed within the subject matters can vary across individuals.
Wait, but in what sense are they disagreeing? So suppose one person believes of herself that she's in Cleveland, but I don't believe that of myself. Then, does she and I disagree? It seems bizarre to think that we are disagreeing in this just because we differ with regard to whether we each believe of ourselves that we're in Cleveland.
Yes, so this is why the problem rears its head again. So so you get a common subject matter, but because you get this funny kind of common subject matter, it's not obvious that difference in belief with respect to this kind of subject matter makes for a disagreement. You know, in the usual kind of case, if you've got, for example, possible worlds propositions or things that take a truth value, just all it takes is fixing which world is actual to fix what their truth value is. Then difference in belief makes for disagreement. If I believe that the table's flat and you believe the table's not flat, well, context sensitivity aside, then one of us has got to be wrong. You know, if I believe that there are 4 glasses of water on the table and you believe that there are not 4, one of us is going to be wrong. But if I think that my pants are on fire and you don't think that your pants are on fire, we don't thereby disagree. And it needn't be that one of us is wrong. And so one concern about this kind of view is whether you really have gotten disagreement after all. After all, maybe you've gotten a common subject matter, but getting a common subject matter doesn't suffice for getting disagreement. There's a bunch of stuff to say about that. I think there's a pretty clean thing to say about disagreement in moral conversation. So if you think that if you adopt a sort of a Stalnachery view of what the role of assertion is, and you think, when I assert some moral claim, what I'm trying to do is add the content of that claim to the conversation's presuppositions. I'm trying to get everybody who's involved in the conversation to accept it, to accept that everybody else accepts it, to accept that everybody else accepts that everybody else accepts it, and so on. Then what's going to be going on in the case of assertion of something with self-locating or de se content, assertion of some property, is that's a sort of conversational move aimed to get all of the parties to this conversation to self-attribute that property, to take everyone else to self-attribute it, to take everyone else to take everyone else to self-attribute it, and so on.
But wait, let me ask about that solution. So, suppose that someone in Afghanistan makes some assertion, and I never speak with him or interact with him in any way, but just here I am in Connecticut thinking the exact opposite. It somehow seems like there's some way in which we're opposed to each other and which we're disagreeing
Yeah.
with each other. But it can't be because we are trying to do opposite things in the conversation. It seems like
Right.
this sense of opposition or conflict between us isn't a conflict of how a conversation between us would go.
Yeah, good. So one needs to expand out this notion of sort of conversational move a little bit. So the simple clean case is where we're all involved in conversation with each other, and then when I say it's right to phi and you say it's not right to phi, we're just trying to do incompatible things to the conversational context. We're trying to add incompatible presuppositions. I'm trying to add some property, trying to get everybody self-attribute P. You're trying to get everybody self-attribute the complement of P, and we can't. Both of those things can't go, so we're at conversational loggerheads. And then, as you rightly point out, there's going to be cases where we want to say there's disagreement, but the two people who we want to say are disagreeing are not parties to the same conversation. And then you can't say this thing that I just said about sort of incompatible conversational moves. I think you can say a closely related thing, which is that there's this notion of accepting an assertion, where you can accept assertions that don't take place in a conversation that you're party to. You can sort of listen in on other conversations, or hear about other conversations, or somehow get wind of what's happened in other conversations. And you can either accept or reject the assertions that have gotten made in these other conversations that you're not a party to. And this is, again, potentially contentious, but it seems not crazy to think what's involved in accepting some assertion that takes place even in some conversation you're not party to is to accept whatever it is that the conversation would, that the assertion would be aimed to add to the common ground of the conversation in which it takes place. So in order for me to accept to suppose somebody says it's right to phi, and that's a bid to add some property P to the conversational context, to the conversational presuppositions. In order for me, even over in this other conversation, or not involved in conversation at all, just sort of listening in on my headphones, in order for me to accept that guy's assertion of it's right to phi, I need to self-attribute the same property that he's trying to add. I need to self-attribute P. And so again, you're going to get this sense of disagreement where even if the assertions aren't happening in the same context, acceptance of these extra conversational assertions still requires doing something which, in virtue of my views, I'm not prepared to do. So I've got a bunch of beliefs which commit me to not self-attributing P. I've got a bunch of beliefs that I'm not the kind of person who, I'm not the kind of person who has whatever kind of attitude toward phi-ing one's called upon to self-attribute by assertions of its right to phi.
But I'm wondering.
And so there you get another sense of disagreement, at least with other people's assertions, even if they're not parties to the conversation, because there's still this notion of accepting an assertion that's not, even if it doesn't happen within the conversation that you're a part of.
But I wonder if you could say something a little bit more about sort of the role of this formal system. So intuitively, it seems like in our culture, there's a really big conflict about this question, the question as to whether morality is relative or whether it's objective, where, for example, many conservative intellectuals feel that today's leftists are thinking of things in a relative way and that they're deeply mistaken about that, so that if we reach this kind of question, the question that you're describing, in which there are people in another culture, they're saying something, it's different from what we say, and we're wondering whether we should understand them as being wrong, or whether we should understand it as being merely relative, that different people would have radically different opinions about this. So if you adopt a kind of formal system in which, say, the people who have the more relativist view are correct, and those who have the more objective view are mistaken, are you saying that that system sort of really captures what it is that people who have the objective view are saying when they engage in moral discourse? That it's somehow deep within them lies that very view that you are espousing?
Yeah, this is a really hard question. I think it's a general, really hard question about sort of doing philosophical analysis of stuff, where in general, when you give some story about you've got some target of analysis, and you want to say, here's my story about what it is to believe blah, or here's my story about what people are saying when they say yada. In general, there's this sort of question about whether you're giving a sort of account that's meant to be an interpretation of what people are actually doing, or whether you're offering some sort of nearby, best cleaned up version of a practice which isn't our actual practice, but is the nearest thing that's going to work, the nearest thing that's not going to be subject to some kind of horrible paradox or inconsistency or something, or isn't going to be committed to a bunch of obviously false stuff. So I think Burgess and Rosen call this the hermeneutic versus revolutionary distinction between sort of attempts to try and analyze stuff. And I'm torn about what to think about this. I want to try making it a hermeneutic, sort of interpretive of what's actually going on for at least most people. What sort of standard folk moral practice amounts to, until I'm forced out of it. But I think it's medium likely that I'll be forced out of it and have to go to this is the best sort of nearby consistent thing to be doing, or the best nearby, you're not going to wind up signed up for an error theory thing to be doing.
So if you were speaking, say, with this conservative intellectual I have in mind, Alan Bloom, and he said, everyone is deeply mistaken, moral truths are really objective, these campus radicals are really wrong. And then when I talk about these people in Afghanistan and I say that the things that they believe are mistaken, I'm making this objective claim about what is really morally right, then you might say to him, when I interpret your own statements, the thing that you are actually uttering, the best interpretation of what you're uttering is actually a relativist interpretation. Or at least that would be the first attempt. And it would be that he's somehow mistaken about what it is that he himself means.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that could be going on. So one thing to say in response to that is, well, look, you're speaking a public language, and so what your words mean is hostage to how the public language works, and you can be wrong about that.
Mm-hmm.
And bad news for you, your words don't mean what they think you mean. What do you think they mean? So that's one candidate sort of hardline story. There's another kind of story, which is a sort of break it up by idiolects story. And it's like, well, okay, probably if you try hard enough, and if your particular idiosyncratic usage falls into the right kind of pattern, it could be true that you're speaking some idiolect in which you're making a bunch of claims that really do aim to be objective, and which, if they're true at all, are true of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not true of everybody, they're absolutely false. But notice that lots of other people are not speaking that way. Or it could be that there's it's not clear how different these two proposals are. It could be that there's the sort of ordinary public language thing, and then there's sort of particular uses that people can introduce for particular conversational purposes or particular theoretical purposes. And those uses aren't going to be hostage to what ordinarily happens in the public language. So,
the different possible views now about the culture war are, one is that the people on one side of the culture war really mean different things by their words than people on the other side of the culture war. So in that sense, neither of them is really right or wrong. Or another way to put it is, neither of them is wrong. The people on one side of the culture war are right to say morality is objective, because when they use the word morality, they're referring to something objective. And the other people, they are right to say morality is relative, because when they use these terms, they're referring to something relative. Well, the other view is that the ones who are relativist are really right, and they are giving the right interpretation of what the others mean. So when the others say we don't mean that, they're actually mistaken. They do mean that.
Well, I mean, it could be that they mean that. So in the sense of like what they're trying to say and the belief they're trying to express is that, without it being the case that the public language sentences they use to try and express their beliefs mean that.
Oh, right.
Right. And I mean, so I think, and also on the first sort of option, where you think, in some sense, there's a talking past that people are just deciding to use their words differently because the sort of patterns of usage on the two different sides are sufficiently different that it makes it the case that the best interpretations of them are different. And so the right thing to think is just people on the one side of the divide mean one thing, people on the other side of the divide mean another thing. There could still be criticism that's appropriate of one side or the other, because it could be that there's a better way to use the terms. It might be that given the sorts of purposes to which we want to put these terms in this kind of talk, there's a better way to use it. It might be that there's the objective use better fits our purposes in going in for moral talk, or it might be that the relative use better fits our purposes in going in for moral talk. And so, even though then people wouldn't be expressing falsehoods when they say my talk is relative or my talk is objective, they'd be correctly describing their own use. It could still be that it's a mistake to go in for the kind of use that they really are going in for.
But it seems to me like the kind of view that you're offering, in the larger conflict about these issues, it does sort of give something to each side. Because the sort of view that you're offering, it says in some sense these things are relative, but it doesn't say that kind of anything goes. There's still a standard, and a lot of things that people are saying could just turn out by that standard to be wrong.
Yeah, right. So one sort of common knee-jerk way to think about a relativist view is to either just interpret, and just to interpret the relativist as thinking that if X believes that P, then P is true for X, and you don't have to be signed up for that. You can see that from looking at the way that they say or self-locating belief works in general. That I can wrongly believe that my pants are on fire. I can wrongly believe that I'm in Cleveland. So I can, because in general I can self-attribute properties that I don't in fact have. Now, how much distance you're going to get between people's moral beliefs and the beliefs that they ought to have if they're going to be correct in their beliefs, how much room for error you have, is going to depend a little bit on what kind of story you tell exactly about which properties you think we're self-attributing when we go in for moral beliefs. And the kind of story I'm sympathetic to is a sort of an attitude-based view, a sort of a relativization of a lot of the kinds of attitude-based reductionist theories that you see in metaethics, where start off where you say what it is for it to be right to phi is for people to bear a certain kind of attitude toward phi. And for example, there's the kind of Michael Smith view from the moral problem that says, well, for it to be right to phi is for it to be the case that everybody's ideally rational self would advise phi. That's approximately the Smith view. And I mean, you can see on that view there's quite a lot of room for people to be wrong about what's right, because there's an idealization there. The relativized version of that is not that to believe that it's right to phi is to believe that everybody's ideally rational self would advise phi, but to believe that it's right to phi is to self-attribute the property of being somebody whose ideally rational self would advise phi.
And this kind of aspect of your view does seem to provide a really good fit to the empirical data. So if their classmate has these very bizarre moral views, they might think, it's true that he thinks all these strange things, but if he would just think harder about it, if he'd be more rational in his cognition, then he would realize that these things that he's talking about actually are morally bad. But then they might think, as for the Amazonian tribesmen, if that person really thought more deeply about it, it's kind of unclear whether that person would think that it actually is morally bad. And when it comes to the Pentar, even a really idealized version, fully rational extraterrestrial, this extraterrestrial still wouldn't end up concluding that there was something morally bad about these acts. So if you think about it in this way, you could end up with a view that pretty much fits the ordinary folk view, not the sort of anything goes, no matter what you believe, it can be right view, but also not the view that if two people have opposite answers, one of them has got to be mistaken.
Right. Yeah, that's the hope. I mean, that's sort of the target thing, or at least part of the target thing, was to get the contours of where we think where we think somebody's got to be wrong, sort of approximately right.
But you know, when I think about what it is that gives people this fear of relativism, what it is that makes people think relativism's got to be wrong, I wonder how your kind of view would deal with it. So it seems like people have this sense that if we say that, for example, someone in a different, distant culture is doing something morally bad, we might have intuitively the sense that we're really seeing that there's something deeply within itself wrong about what this person is doing. And it seems like what you end up with is that what we're actually seeing is something like we're attributing to ourselves the property of being such that if we thought about it really rationally, we would feel bad about this act, or find this act bad. But we might then still be holding on to the view that if those people performing the act thought about it rationally, they'd end up being lost in this, that it's not capturing the full power of the kind of condemnation that we want to make of these other acts. That this kind of view... So
Sorry,
suppose
that what isn't capturing
I'm
the
speaking
full,
with
the
someone
full
from a
power?
distant culture who's engaged in some kind of very sexist practice. And I say, what you're doing is wrong. And then he says, well, what do you mean by wrong? I don't want to say something like, what I mean is that if I myself became really rational and thought about this really carefully, I'd still find it bad. What I want to say is that somehow it just truly is wrong. Or at least I might have this intuition in that that there's some sense in which there's something bad about this thing. Maybe someone might feel that the kind of view you're developing doesn't capture the sort of depth or power of the condemnation that we want to make of these acts.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is a feature of the view that I'm not fully happy with, that there is a sort of strength of condemnation that I want to be authorized, I want to have be authorized for certain kinds of actions by people who are very different from me, but the view doesn't authorize it. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff to say in order to try and minimize the cost and make the bullet seem not so bad to bite, but I think it really is a cost. I think it really is. There really is this thing that we antecedently wanted from a meta-ethical theory that we don't get. And it's exactly in this place where you were pointing, that we don't, certain kinds of actions that we get to criticize in a certain way. We get to say that they're wrong, where what that means is, well, we get to correctly believe that they're wrong, in the sense that we correctly self-attribute the property of being somebody who wouldn't endorse them under ideal circumstances. We get to probably correctly advise our friends to believe that they're wrong. We get to correctly advise our friends to self-attribute the property of being somebody who wouldn't ideally approve of this kind of practice or wouldn't ideally advise this kind of practice. But we don't get to say that the person who's going in for the practice and endorses it is making a mistake in doing so. Again, there's kind of Weasley stuff we can do to try and get some of that back too, so we can say they're making a mistake if we're allowed to mean by that they're making a mistake by our lights. So, Fred idealized Fred, the sort of totally ideally consistent, coherent, self-endorsing torturer. If he was idealized up by my standards of idealization, he would stop approving of torture. But idealized up by his standards of improvement, he wouldn't stop approving of torture. And so there is a kind of mistake that I don't get to say that he's making. But I think here's the sort of apologetics for the view. I think you get back a lot of what you wanted as far as criticism, and I think as you start to get to the points where the criticism really sticks, where there really isn't any further move to make about allowing the view to say the thing that you want to say, or say something that's very similar to the thing you wanted to say. By the time you get to the points where the complaint really sticks, I think the intuitions are less secure that we really want to be able to make that criticism. And it becomes also, I think, less clear that the sort of practice of moralizing being well suited to play the roles that it's supposed to play and guiding our lives and making sure we get along together and stuff like that depends on being able to make that kind of criticism. So the hope is that the kinds of criticism that really are authorized by the view are all that we're really sure we need, and all that we need in order to make the practice of moralizing one that is a good one to go in for and is fit to serve the purposes that the practice of moralizing actually
when you started
plays.
out, you introduced this distinction between two ways of thinking about this, what you called hermeneutic and revolutionary, where hermeneutic is just trying to understand, make sense of people's ordinary practice, and revolutionary is trying to introduce a change in it in some way. And as we continue talking about this, I begin feeling more and more that within the ordinary practice, there's this kind of tension, that there are intuitions we have on both sides and so forth, and that if we wanted to have an interpretation that fit people's ordinary practice, it wouldn't be an interpretation that provided, say, formal semantics according to which this is all perfectly coherent, but it would be an interpretation which somehow tried to capture that tension, or to say that within people's ordinary practice there are things pulling them in different directions.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a certain kind of pulling in different directions that the sort of de se relativist view gets, but I mean, at this particular point, I think it doesn't get it. So at this particular point, is this what you were thinking about this point, that there's some pull to saying that the very strong Fred, the ideally coherent torturer, is making a mistake and sort of is failing, making a mistake that he ought to be able, from the inside, to get a hold on. But there's some pull towards saying that, and there's some pull away from saying that, and we want, in a sort of story about
even
practice, would
the reason
account
that
for
people
both of
end
those
up coming
pulls.
down on different sides has to do with how strong these different pulls are within each of them, so that maybe there are different people and they each experience a pull in one direction and a pull in another, but some are more pulled in one direction, some more in another. It seems like what's coming out of the experimental data is that there are certain kinds of general facts about someone's personality that lead them to drive more toward a relativist view or more toward an objectivist view. So, for example, people who are higher in the personality trait of openness to experience tend more to agree with relativism, while people who have this attitude that's sometimes called closed-mindedness often give more an objectivist answer. Or if you give people tasks that measure what's called disjunctive thinking, which is the tendency to think about a large number of different possibilities, to really consider all the different possibilities, people who are high in that tendency adopt more of a relativist view. So then, looking at these kind of data, it might not seem possible to develop a single theory that would be the theory that accurately captured the intuitions of all of these different people, but you'd want a theory that somehow could explain that tension, explain what it was that was leading the people higher in openness to experience to adopt one view, lower in openness to experience to adopt the other view, and so forth.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So right, I think, yeah, so there's a bunch of interesting stuff there. So, like, one thing you might want is you might want you might want two different metaethical theories. You might want a metaethical theory for a metaethical theory for the open-minded and a metaethical theory for the closed-minded. And it might be that it's different. The right interpretation of moral talk for the in the different people's mouths is different. It'd be a little bit unfortunate to have that be true. It would be nice to be able to have a sort of general story about what we're doing when we're going in for moral talk, such that it's not that, you know, this group is doing this thing when they go in for moral talk, and that group is doing that other thing when they go in for moral talk. You'd at least want some fancy story about why those two things have got some interesting connection to each other, and why they're sort of in competition for the same spot in people's heads.
Well, there's
the
maybe some sense in which you could
sort of social
depart
practices.
from this effort just to interpret people's ordinary practice and say, there's some further reason why people who have one of these views are wrong. Not a reason that has to do with offering the best interpretation of their practice, but something more genuinely normative.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So it might be that one or the other of the kinds of practices is, for example, better fitted to serve the purposes that moral thought and talk serve in our lives, in, you know, the guidance of behavior and maintenance of smooth relations between people and so on. And that would be interesting.
Well, maybe we should actually close on that note. So, in the one sort of interesting aspect of the view that you've been putting forward is its capacity to somehow make sense of that notion that our moral thought and talk have a certain kind of function in our lives, and that this view can somehow capture that function. So how would you say that? How can this idea that you're talking about of self-ascription, how can it explain the distinctive role that morality plays in human life?
Yeah, that is a hard question. So roughly, here's sort of outline of the story. Here's a case. So suppose we think believing that it's right to phi is believing that your ideally rational self would advise phi. It's self-attributing the property of being somebody whose ideally rational self would advise phi. I'm tempted to insert a lot of qualifications, but I'm just going to say this thing is not quite right, which is that. So suppose you think that, and then you think, well, what's going on when I say it's right to give to Oxfam? Well, I'm trying to get everybody who I'm talking to self-attribute this property of being somebody whose ideally rational self would advise giving to Oxfam. Suppose that works. Suppose I succeed, and everybody goes along, and everybody winds up self-attributing the property. Then we will wind up with a group of people who are all sort of on the same page with respect to their idealized attitudes toward giving to Oxfam. They all think that their ideally rational selves would advise it. They all think that everybody else thinks that their ideally rational selves would advise it, and so on and so forth. And that's going to wind up producing a certain amount of coordination with respect to what people do. People are going to thereby be to some extent motivated, plausibly, again, complaints to make, but plausibly going to be to some extent motivated to give to Oxfam. If everybody winds up self-attributing the property of being somebody whose ideally rational self would advise against stealing, that is, if everybody winds up believing it's wrong to steal, you're going to wind up with a bunch of people who are similarly inclined with respect to stealing, at least to some extent, so that have got a certain amount of common motivation with respect to stealing. And so this kind of thing, where we, by going in for moral talk and by establishing commonality in our moral beliefs, that is, establishing commonality in our beliefs about what kinds of actions we would ideally advise or advise against, we're going to wind up producing a bunch of common dispositions to go in for a certain kind of behaviors and a bunch of common expectations of each other, of what other people are going to be motivated to do. And so this is the sort of thing that looks like it's going to be potentially conducive to coordination in the way that plausibly moral discourse is in fact conducive to coordination. And so the hope is that the way in which establishing common ground about these ideal advice properties or ideal attitude properties, the way in which establishing common ground about that aids in coordination maps nicely onto the way in which establishing a common moral view aids in coordination. And I mean, that's a case that needs to be made in detail, but it seems to me not crazy that those are going to line up pretty nicely together. And if they do line up pretty nicely together,
on that rousing note,
something
maybe
good
we
to
should
say about them.
conclude. Oh, good talking with you. Bye, Andy.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Josh.